Thank you for joining us. So today, I'm very excited to uh, introduce you to three of our graduate students uh, work in our science education department research group. We call it Policy Group. Actually, we have four students today, but one isn't feeling very well, so he was here from three of them. Uh, Two of them worked on the data sets that we collected in 2017, uh, and another one worked on the data set we collected earlier in 2014 about computer science. Uh, uh, so I will just start with Zohal and give her a brief introduction. So Zohal is a current master's student in the Technology Education Innovation Program at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Outside of the Science Education Department, she is also involved in research at the Learning, Innovation, and Technology Lab, where she's helping co-design and conduct a study on remote makerspace education through augmented reality or virtual reality technology. Previously, she worked at the edX, a education technology nonprofit based in Cambridge, analyzing learner and course metrics to best support the user base. She's interested in informal and formal methods that can mitigate barriers to entry the STEM for underrepresented population by pursuing educational research through a intersectional perspective, contextualizing equity, opportunity and diversity within policy and practices. So, Zoho, if you want to share your screen, you can start.
Thank you, Chen. Can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Perfect, great. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Chen, for that introduction. Like Chen said, I'm a current master's student in the Technology Innovation and Education program, and so I'll be graduating this May. I'm very interested in research regarding identity and interest in STEM and finding opportunities within informal and formal educational activities that can mitigate barriers to entry. And so today my research focus is on the influence of computer gameplay and social media use on computer science identity and computer science career interests. Uh, in recent years, researchers have been discussing how computer games can be beneficial and serve as a stepping stone for cultivating STEM interests. However, the discourse has been quite controversial. There has been a lot of anecdotal debate on the benefits and uh, perceived negative outcomes that are associated with computer games. However, there's been a lack of empirical evidence. So in this study, we are going to investigate this topic by using a larger sample size, and specifically, we will look at if gameplay encourages CS identity and career interests. We'll also examine social media use as well, as that's very prevalent in the youth. And we will also examine if there are any outstanding gender differences, as recent statistics also indicate that only 19% of undergraduate computer degree holders were women. Adolescents spend a great deal of their time on computer, popular activities including watching videos, playing video games, and communicating through social media. Computer literacy can be developed in these out-of-school contexts, and in fact, incidental experiences can encourage the development of a computer knowledge that is both declarative and practical. For instance, adolescents who fix the internet to log into Facebook can lead to the comprehension of an IP address. Literature has also emphasized the increasing influence computer games has on developing confidence and computer literacy and interest in computer science. They provide a platform that introduces the creative components of computing and offer an opportunity to interact with technology in an authentic and comfortable setting. Experience with computer games can also help instill the self-efficacy, motivation, and perceived relevance necessary for the development of a computer science identity. It offers agency to learners to explore and learn without constraints, allowing the ability to develop a sense of identity independently. Exposure to computers through daily activities like computer games can also encourage computer science interest and bolster its relevance to the individual. Exposure to a variety of games allows players to firsthand experience the benefits of computer gameplay and computer literacy. Oh, sorry. Based on previous literature, we also know there is evidence of a relationship between computer gameplay and computer science identity. However, there are also notable gender differences. The paucity of female-oriented computer games adversely impacts the computing identity formation for girls in their primary years. These inequalities in these experiences can limit choices and opportunities. This lack of inclusion can also cultivate stereotypes on computing identity and pose as a barrier for women who may consider enrolling into computer science-related courses otherwise. There is also discourse on the duration of gameplay and its perceived risks and benefits. However, there is still uncertainty on the amount of gameplay that is considered excessive and the amount that is right for cultivating a computer science interest. As previously mentioned, adolescents spend a large amount of their time on social networking sites. Research has shown that excessive use of social networking sites can trigger addiction, resulting in negative behavioral outcomes. However, studies also depict problematic behavior in association with computer games as well. Constant exposure to violent computer games may decrease pro-social behavior. However, social media use could help adolescents work through issues of identity and potentially encourage healthy development. In fact, students have shared that use of social media provides a platform for integrative learning, and an improvement of cooperative learning abilities has been discovered. It could potentially mitigate the issue of poor communication skills that result from excessive gameplay. So we also explore social media can predict a computer science identity and career interest. The expectancy value theory is also valuable in helping to understand the potential effect of gaming on computer science identity and career interest. The theory states an individual's perspective on their task ability and task relevance of a specific activity determines their achievement. In particular, it suggests the determinants of motivation are drawn from self-efficacy, task relevance, and perceived task ability. Computer science identity is measured through the channels of recognition, interest, and performance. Exposure to computers through daily happenings such as computer games and social media can encourage computer science interest and bolster its relevance to the individual. And in fact, gameplay's positive correlation with computer self-efficacy indicates the relevance of prior computer experiences in developing self-efficacy. However, as stated before, none of these findings so far have had any large-scale empirical evidence, and they did not look into the long-term effect, such as high school experiences that may influence student college-level career interests. In this study, we try to address this issue and provide clarity on whether the duration of computer gameplay and social media use in high school may be associated with computer science affinity and literacy for students of different genders in college. The research questions that frame the study are: to what extent at the beginning of college is the duration of daily computer gameplay and duration of daily social media use in high school associated with a computer science identity and computer science career interest? And does the relationship between the duration of computer gameplay and social media use differ between genders in regards to computer science identity or computer science career interests? The survey we used was Factors Influencing College Success in Informational Technology. It was administered in the fall of 2014 to students enrolled in introductory level computer science, and the sample size was a stratified random sampling of 10,197 students across 118 higher education institutions. The survey we used also consisted of 50 questions that asked the students demographic and background information, high school courses taken and grades received, earlier experiences with computers, the organization and structure of their most advanced high school computer science classes, their thoughts and feelings about computer science, and their future career plans. The main predictors were hours of computer gameplay and hours of social media use. The outcomes were computer science identity, computer science career interest versus science engineering, non-STEM, and medicine health. And our control variables were gender, race and ethnicity, hours of social media use, hours of computer use, some of computer-related activities, high school English and pre-calculus grades in high school, level of parent education for both mother and father, CS involvement and interest of parents. In our survey, we asked, on average, while you were in high school, how many hours per day did you spend playing video games? For the daily hours of computer gameplay, The responses were then taken put on a linearized scale. For daily hours of social media use, we asked, on average, while you were in high school, how many hours per day did you spend using the internet for social media? And again, we use the responses in a linearized scale for the analysis. Our outcome variables were computer science identity and computer science career interest. There were 6 Likert scale items, and we created a composite score for the average identity through the 6 items and treated it as a CS identity outcome continuous variable. For computer science career interest, there were 15 career choices the respondents could select from. They were bucketed into the categories of medicine and health, non-STEM, science, engineering, and computer science. Because computer science identity is on a linear scale, we performed a linear regression analysis, and because computer science career interest was categorical, a multinomial logistic regression analysis was used. In this presentation, I will report models only if the effects are significant. I will be representing the main effects of both regression analyses, along with a quadratic for the linear regression and an interaction effect for the logistic regression. An interaction effect was tested for the linear regression, however, it was not significant, so it's not presented in this. Looking at the main effects of the linear regression, we do see that the coefficient for gender is positive and males are coded as 1. So naturally, these male respondents in the survey have a higher computer science identity. We can also see that for both male and female students, there's an increased computer science identity associated with computer gameplay. And for social media use, we see there's an associated decrease in computer science identity with the negative coefficient. To examine if the relationship between computer gameplay and computer science identity is positive and linear at every hour of play, a quadratic was added to the regression. We see the coefficient is actually negative for the quadratic, and it is statistically significant. So at some number of hours of computer gameplay, it is no longer associated with a higher computer science identity. Similarly, the relationship between social media use and computer science identity is not negative and linear at every hour of play. We see again, the coefficient is positive and significant. So at some number of hours of social media use, computer science identity no longer decreases and levels out. Here is a depiction of computer science identity and gameplay in full scale. You can see that the computer science identity plateaus around 6 hours of gameplay. If we zoom in further, I've also circled the points of average computer gameplay for female students, which is 1 hour, and the average amount of play for male students, which is 2 hours. At their average amount of play, the computer science identity is higher for males than for female students. And in fact, it would take about 4 hours of computer gameplay for female students to match the CS identity of male students who play for 2 hours. Here's the relationship between social media use and computer science identity on the full scale. And we see between 4 to 6 hours, the computer science identity begins to level out. And again, if we zoom in further, I've also noted the average hours amount of social media use for female students, which is in fact 2 hours, and the average amount of social media use for male students, which is 1 hour. And at their average amounts of social media use, male computer science identity is still higher. And in fact, it does not match the female computer science identity even after several hours of social media use. Next was our multinomial logistic regression analysis, and these are the main effects. And we see actually that for every additional hour of gameplay, it is associated with an increase in the odds of having a computer science career interest. The other career interests go down for both male and female respondents if we look at the graph from left to right. And here I've also noted the average amounts of play for female and male students. So female students play an average of 1 hour and male students play an average of 2 hours. And the probability of cultivating a CS career interest is much higher for the male respondents. Our next slide includes the interaction effect between computer gameplay and computer science career interest. And we actually see that the interaction is right here. From left to right, the lines are no longer parallel. There's specifically an interaction between non-STEM and computer science career interests, between gender and computer gameplay within those two career interests. So the gender difference in computer science career interests actually widens as males and females play more games. So in comparison to female students, males have an additional 10% increase in the odds of a computer science career interest relative to non-STEM career interest for every additional hour of computer gameplay. So playing games is associated with an increase in computer science career interest for females as well. And so it is still advisable to tell female students to play games. However, the effect is not as high as it is for male students. When looking at these are the average amounts of play again. And as said before, male students have a higher computer science career interest than female students at their average amounts of play. When looking at the daily hours of social media use, we actually see that as both male and female students start to spend more time on social media, the gap between them and computer science career interest converges. And I will again circle their average amounts of social media use, and for female students is 2 hours. For male students, it's 1 hour. And again, it is still lower for female students at their average amounts of social media use than for male students. And so males have a 12% decrease in the odds of a CS career interest when using social media. So our key findings, every standard deviation unit increase in computer gameplay for all students is associated with a 0.10 standard deviation increase in computer science identity. Every standard deviation unit increase in social media use is associated with a negative 0.07 standard deviation decrease in CS identity. Male identifying students have a higher average computer science identity by 0.22 standard deviation units. Predicted CS identity plateaus after 6 hours of computer gameplay and levels out after 4 to 6 hours of social media use. Male identifying students have a 27% increase in the relative odd of a CS career interest over non-STEM career interest for every additional hour of gameplay. Male identifying students also have a 14% decrease in the odds of having a CS career interest over non-STEM career interest for every additional hour of social media use. So what do these findings mean? Well, they do confirm that there is empirical evidence of a significant difference in computer science identity for male and female identifying students, as well as a difference in the likelihood of gameplay cultivating a computer science career interest over a non-STEM career interest. Additionally, social media use is negatively associated with computer science identity and career interest for both male and female respondents. So though social media can create opportunities for communication skills, excessive use hinders opportunities from cultivating computational literacy. And these findings do suggest overall that females are at a disadvantage in cultivating a computer science identity or cultivating a computer science career interest in comparison to males. However, we can't forget that computer gameplay is positively associated for both respondents for CS identity and career interests. And daily computer gameplay that is within the 6-hour threshold could potentially bridge the gap between both genders. And in fact, COVID-19 has shifted many of our adolescent activities due to lockdown measures. Video game consumption increased by 46% alone in the first 3 months of the pandemic. So especially during this time where online education has disrupted, so has the online presence of students. Parents, educators, and school districts should consider incorporating and encouraging computer gameplay as a regular activity for female students and discourage excessive social media use instead. Some limitations I would like to note are the gender classification for the students. This survey was administered in 2014 and students were limited with selecting between male and female. So further studies should look at what more inclusive gender questions could show into terms of findings. And as we also do not know the variety of computer games that are played by these students. So we're not sure if there's a certain type of game that promotes a greater computer science identity and career interest across all students. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Zohal. We're open to questions. We have time for about 3 to 4 questions from our audience. Well, I have a question when you're in with your slides about a career interest. So it seems that playing computer game only promotes computer science career interest, right? So it still is negatively associated with almost any other career interest. So I wonder what your you know implication you have with that, and like pragmatically, should we still encourage students to play so many hours computer game when we know that nearly every other career interest will go down? Like, I just wonder if you have any reflection on this.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that goes into the limitation of knowing what variety of games can actually instill the computer science identity among students. So there was some discourse on educational computer games that teachers can incorporate. And so if you're using your time to play like games that are helping you learn subject expertise, then potentially it could balance out that the thought, like the negative association between playing games and the other career interests,
Great,
if
thank
they're
you.
more focused on the schoolwork. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think Irvin has his hand up. You are muted, Irvin. Uh, can't hear you.
Okay,
Oh yeah,
now I'm unmuted. Sorry.
right.
I was wondering what sort of implications you might make in terms of policy that you think might affect the relative, uh, the gender effect that you noticed. In other words, is it really intrinsic to gender, or is it intrinsic to something that genders tend to do that differentiate them? And what sort of policy implications would you make in the uh, application of computer interest or computer indulgence or activities of students that might change this gender indication? I
That's a
didn't say that very well.
I understand what you're asking though. I think that's a great question. So, like, a part of the literature talks about how a lot of these games are marketed towards, young males and not necessarily young females. And though you can't really regulate what businesses are creating, I think if if computer science courses or activities that are within school are more geared towards using computers, it could potentially, you know, mitigate that gap between gender. So, for instance, like I had mentioned earlier, like the educational computer games. So, if you have to take most technology classes are now required in high school. So, if you're actively playing games or like doing something with the computer in that aspect where you're learning computer literacy, um, it could potentially like if you enforce that through like state policy and making sure that computer literacy is emphasized in your coursework for graduation, then there's potential for curriculum to incorporate educational computer games in those courses, and that could potentially influence like the gender gap per se.
Has anyone um, done anything to try this out to test whether it would work or not in eliminating the gender difference?
No, a lot of like the previous studies were more so on college classes and asking them like what made you pursue this, like college CS students. And a lot of them, the discourse was like, oh, I played games, so I wanted to know how to make them.
Hmm.
And when they tested the games in those with the college level computer science degree holders, they said that yeah, like these games like help me scaffold the skills I do have and the skills I need to learn. But those games again were educational, so it might be in fact that like maybe intentional um, intentional games might be more useful in terms of policy than like unintentional gameplay, but that's like another facet to visit of the literature.
Thank you.
Next, we have Phil.
Yeah, great job, Zohal. Really nice. Um, I have a question which is sort of in common to many of our studies, which is um, they are surveys, and so there's an issue around causal conclusions, around causality. And I wonder if you might say something uh, about that issue and how you think about it in your study.
Yeah, I mean, I think the issue here, of course, is that like this wasn't randomized. It was like in that sense, so there you can't really assume causality, and so I think um, it would be interesting to see if you administered a survey after having like in a institution itself having a half of the program like the computer science or IT majors um, go through a treatment of playing games to learn and the other half not. Or if we wanted like a discontinuity analysis, we could start with high schoolers and see their trajectory and those high schoolers who received educational computer games in their technology courses, see if they end up enrolling into computer science and like compare them to the control, which has no gameplay element. So I think like a future study would need to be a little bit more longitudinal and like
Mm-hmm.
look over 8 years, basically all of high school and all of college, and then would have to do like a discontinuity analysis to see if there is any change in enrollment. But with this study, something like this, we're using older data. It's like more of like an emerging trend or a hypothesis you have, and seeing that if it works in practice.
Yeah, I mean, one that's a good point, and this is certainly not an experimental study like Irwin is talking about, where you would actually try to change something and then see if there's a result. There are these pseudo experimental studies where there might be a huge difference in in the kids who want to go on to a CS career and those who don't in our study. That's sort of hidden in some way that we don't account for, and so there are propensity methods that sort of equalize the groups. You essentially create a control group from your sample, and you create treatment groups sort of after the fact, and that cleans up some of the problems in these correlational studies. So that might be something to think about as you learn more statistical tools. That might be worth revisiting.
Um,
And
I,
certainly Chen and Gerhard can help you with those because they're experts.
So I was curious. I know there's a number of studies out there on the ways people engage with social media, whether or not kind of like that producers versus lurkers concept, right? Are they actively making things on social media? Or are they kind of just perusing it and seeing what everybody else is doing? And most of those are around kind of like self-esteem, but I'm curious if you have any thoughts on looking at it that way as far as career interest, right? If somebody is actively making things on social media versus kind of just looking at it, thinking through kind of what future studies you could do that way.
could you be a little bit more specific about making things? Like, do you mean like design or?
So typically when you're looking at social media, there's kind of like the producers are people that are actively posting, they're creating content. So maybe they're making videos, they're um, photoshopping, they're doing all these different things to put something onto social media versus kind of the lurkers who are maybe liking other people's things or commenting on them. But there's kind of this gradient of types of ways people engage with social media.
Okay. So, and sorry, your question was to see like if there's like a difference in what the literature says about students who use social media more. Sorry.
So just kind of your thoughts on like how that might play into if you were able to look into that concept, like spread out the viewers of social media, the users of social media, and their connection to computer science that way?
Yeah, so from the literature I have read about social media, students or anyone honestly who uses social media to potentially communicate about a problem or figure something out in terms of like solving a problem tend to have like higher rates of computer literacy, because they so I think one of the things I mentioned was they couldn't get into Facebook and they like loved using Facebook, but then they had to figure out like how to fix their IP address. And so like instances like that where they have to put two and two together because they're that dedicated to like maybe posting content, creating something, and they wanted to navigate how to fix their access to it, they tend to have like higher computer literacy skills rather than, as you were saying, those who just like or like, um, low touch social media users. And so they say that actually like the students who also use it as a platform to communicate for CS courses like find the learning to be more interrelated, more integrated, and feel more positive about it with the collaboration aspect. But then it's the excessive use that kind of decreases the pro-social behavior, but it decreases also for computer gameplay, which is also interesting. So that's why I decided to investigate to see if like social media was definitely negative or not fully truly negative with the computer science identity.
Great, thanks.
We have Tommy, and then we need to move on to the next presentation, right? Tommy, you have the mic. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks for the presentation. I have a question that's a little similar to Erica's in that for video games, like, do you think how people engage with video games matters? And I think past literature indicates that there is a baseline difference in, for example, the types of video games that people tend to prefer by gender. I don't know if there's a way in your data set to kind of account for like whether or not people like different types of games, but do you have any kind of thoughts on, like, do you think this effect is agnostic to the way the people interact with these stimuli, or do you think that there are more things in like the content matters, or maybe the type of engagement matters?
I do think the content does matter. The survey didn't ask about content, to be honest. It was more focused on duration rather than variety, which was why I addressed that as a limitation. But from my literature review, I did see that like most of the aggressive content, usually one was averse for female students. They didn't engage in games that were more violent and aggressive, and it also increased more like negative behavioral outcomes for male respondents who played like much more violent games. And so I do think that there is a content aspect to one, like what kind of gender identity you like will be marketed towards, like what kind of people actually play certain kinds of games. And then also on top of that, another layer of like, will that content make you less social, make you more aggressive, and have negative behavioral outcomes? So I do think like a larger part of this is like the kind of games you're interacting with. And so like some of the discourses, like maybe we should look more closely into educational computer games and see if that's like more beneficial. But that is even more like limited in nature in terms of like what is out there.
Thank you.
Thank you, Zohal, for your excellent presentation. If others have questions, you should email to Zohal. If Zohal can leave your email address in the chat box, and people may reach out to you. All right. Next, we have Elizabeth O. Elizabeth is currently a student in the master program in human development and psychology at Harvard Graduate School of Education. Prior to coming to Huxley, she obtained a bachelor in the science in applied learning and development, youth and community studies from the University of Texas at Austin. Her main research interest is cognitive psychology and immigrant generations, and she is currently a research assistant with the Reach Every Reader research project strand of the pre-K home and family engagement program, which is aimed at supporting students who struggle with reading. Elizabeth is from South Korea and currently living in Austin, Texas. In this coming fall, she will be attending Teachers College at Columbia University for the PhD program in cognitive science in education. All right, Elizabeth, you have the stage.
Okay, can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Got it. Hi, everyone. My name is Elizabeth, and I'm currently studying human development and psychology at Harvard Graduate School of Education. And today I'm going to present about the immigrant generation, out of school time activity, and STEM career choice. So I'm going to talk about the background and the context. So basically why I focus on OST STEM activity and immigrant students. So the first, this STEM occupation has increased over time. For example, in this graph, during the 2010 to 20, employment in science and education engineer occupation grew by almost 19% compared to 14% for all other occupation, according to the National Science Foundation. Also, one of the ways to promote the students' STEM interest is out of school time activity. For example, this is the one of the meta-analysis that I found. As you guys can see in the middle, students who participate longer time in the OST STEM activity, including both structured and unstructured activity, show higher STEM interest and their STEM career choice compared to the students who participate less time or none in OST. And lastly, and not only the education or the job market, recently this year, January, from the Biden administration has provided to OST career pathway opportunity to students to increase their STEM interest and lead them to the STEM occupation. And I have a short video that I can show you guys like how pervasive stereotype among the immigrant students in STEM field. So I'm just gonna play.
Tell me you're an immigrant kid without actually telling me you're an immigrant kid.
I have an engineering degree. Yeah. Because I didn't want to be a doctor.
So as you guys will watch the video about the stereotype of immigrant students, many people think that most immigrant students actually going to either go to STEM or medical school. And in reality, that is actually somehow right in the US. Among the increase in the STEM workforce labor in the US, one of the salient workers are immigrants. According to the American Immigration Council in 2017, immigrant students entered to the STEM workforce increased from 12 to 25% in STEM field in 2015, which means that it should be more in 2021. And also, it is actually hard to consider the immigrant population apart from the US, since the immigrant population has exponentially increased over time. And this graph indicates that 1 in 4 children in the US is a child of immigrant with at least one immigrant parent. So to recap the background knowledge, we know that there are numerous STEM occupations out there in the job market, and OST STEM activity is one of the main tools to promote the students' STEM interest. And a lot of immigrant students choose to go to STEM career, but we don't know how immigrant students actually participate in OST STEM activity and why many immigrant students decide to go to STEM field. So based on this context, my research question is that does students of different immigration status have different rate of participation in structured and unstructured out of school time STEM activity? And do this out of school time STEM activity have different effects on students' STEM career interests depending upon immigrant generations? So now we are going to talk about the research design. For my dependent variable is structured and unstructured OST STEM activity and STEM career interest. And my independent variable is the immigrant generations. And my control variable, I control for the gender, race, and parents' career and their educational attainment. So for the structured OST STEM activity, there are 21 structured activity in the survey. And students mark the activity if they open time participating in those during the high school. So in the survey, structured activity is like a science fair or STEM related lectures and so on. As the same way, there are 24 unstructured STEM activity, and students mark the activity if they open time participate in those during the high school. So in the survey, unstructured OST STEM activity is like a baking, cooking, or watching online STEM video and so on. For the STEM career interest, if they mark any of those STEM careers, such as computer scientist or engineer, it was indicated as 1 and 0 for the no interest. So to define the immigrant generation, the 4 variables were used: student mothers and fathers, birthplace, and the location where the students receive their high school education. To look more closely, the foreign students, they are who went to the high school outside of the US and they were not born in the US and have at least one parent who born outside of the US. So the total number of the foreign student in this sample is 654 and around 5% in our samples. And only difference between the first generation and the foreign student is that the foreign student went to the high school outside of the US, whereas the first generation students went to the school in the US, and they are around 10% in the sample. And difference between the first and second generation is that the first generation were not born in the US, whereas the second generation born in the US, and they were 25% in our sample. And third plus generation, which is the literally non-immigrant students, were born in the US and their both parents also born in the US and they received their high school education in the US. And they are total 61% in our sample. And also I control for all other personal variable and information that you guys can see in this table. So moving on to the methodology, the first, I use the exploratory data analyst to capture the overall pattern of the OST STEM activity by immigrant generation during the high school. And also OST STEM activity are count variable. I used Poisson regression model to identify the relationship between the immigrant generation and participation in structured and unstructured OST STEM activity. Lastly, because the STEM career interest is binary variable, I used the multivariable logistic regression model to identify the relationship between the immigrant generation and their STEM career interest. So in terms of the result, the first, I'm not going to give you all my whole diary of an analyst, but to briefly show you the general pattern is that most foreign and the first generation, which is the red and green dot, have a higher participation rate at the most structured STEM activity compared to the non-immigrant students. Whereas the second generation, which is the blue dot, is slightly higher for the certain activity, but most of the activity tend to show the similar participation with the non-immigrant students. But in contrast, in unstructured OST STEM activity, we see the kind of opposite of the participation. So the all immigrant generation have a lower participation at the most unstructured activity, but decrease is slightly weaker for certain activity compared to the non-immigrant students. So to look more closely, we performed the Poisson regression model. So like as you guys can see in this table, all immigrant generation tend to participate more in structured OST STEM activity, like we already actually observed in the exploratory data analyst. But in particular, the first generation is statistically significant. So the first generation is the highest participation in the structured activity compared to the foreign, second, and non-immigrant students. But in contrast, we actually already know from the exploratory data analyst, unstructured activity, all immigrant generation tend to less participate in unstructured activity, and they are all statistically significant compared to the non-immigrant students. Therefore, we can conclude that there are different participation rate between the immigrant generation and non-immigrant students based on those results. Lastly, we can move on to the multivariable regression. So to determine the relationship between the immigrant generation and STEM career interests, we performed the multivariable logistic regression model to predict the end of high school STEM career interest. So we control for all other variables. We found that the structure and unstructured STEM activity have a positive and significant effects on student STEM career interest in general population. Now we focus on the immigrant generation. We found that the foreign and the first generation students in particular have a higher interest in pursuing the STEM career compared to the non-immigrant students. But we didn't find the difference between the second generation and non-immigrant students' STEM career interest in OST STEM activity. And in terms of the interaction effect, because I didn't find any significant interaction effect between the structured OST STEM activity and immigrant generation, I didn't include in this table, but we found that the effects of unstructured activity is similar for all immigrant generation except for the first generation. In other words, the relationship between the unstructured OST STEM activity and STEM career interest is around 4% less in first generation as they participate more in unstructured OST STEM activity. And as we can see this pattern as a visual graph, and I have a nifty graph here, right here. So the foreign second generation and the non-immigrant students are showing upgoing trend, but the first generation, which is the here blue line, is showing the almost the flat trend as they participate more on structured OST STEM activity. So to recap the result for summary, the first, we found that all immigrant generation, especially for the first generation, tend to participate more in structured OST STEM activity compared to the non-immigrant students. Second, in contrast, all immigrant generation tend to less participate in unstructured OST STEM activity compared to the non-immigrant students. Also, we found that the foreign and the first generation tend to be interested more in STEM career compared to the non-immigrant students. However, we also found that the interaction effect that unstructured OST STEM activity have a negative impacts on first generation STEM career interest. And for implication from this research suggests that OST STEM activity, which goal is to increase the STEM career interest, should be designed meaningfully and accessible for all students, including the immigrant students. And because we have some kind of limitation in our study, and we can suggest for the future study that they should closely examine the reason why immigrant students tend to participate less in unstructured activity compared to the non-immigrant students. Also, they can explore more about the possible types of intervention that can increase non-immigrant students' participation in structured OST STEM activity. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Good job. Any question from our audience? Well, in the exploratory graph, if you can share screen again,
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of dots and maybe people need some time to digest. What I found very interesting regarding to unstructured activity. Yeah.
Right here.
Unstructured. Next slide.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you look at the activities where immigrant students are lacking the most are things like taking care of animal, observing animal, observing the star, gardening, baking and cooking, such as such. That typically requires one to have a garden, right? And to have a big kitchen. So yeah, I think there's a lot of space facilities involved in this activity. So I wonder what you thought about the maybe SES disparity between different immigration generations and how that enables some unstructured activity, whereas prohibits some for different people.
Yeah, that's really good question. And I actually, because I don't have any answer at this point, but that will be for the future study. But I kind of assume that, like you said, the immigrant students, they are in general population, they are tend to have a lower SES, and they're also their parents also more likely to be both parents are working, so they may not have like enough space for that, and also they might not have enough time for that, and those kind of unstructured activity requires a lot of other kind of supervisions, I believe. So there's a lot of assumption that why immigrant students participate less kind of those unstructured activity. But yeah, we can actually, for the future study, can look into why, and we can improve that and reflect those to the unstructured activity policy or for the education.
Great. Thank you.
I wonder if people would like to see the other slide again too. I know it's a different, the structured,
Oh, the structure one.
because there was a lot on there too, just to see. It looks like group organizations like scouting is probably the thing that's not.
Yeah, they might not, school might not offer those kind of activity, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very interesting and puzzling as well. It is actually well known in the literature that unstructured activity is most effective in promoting STEM career interest. And we also know that immigrant students are more likely to go to a STEM career. So intuitive guess would be immigrant students would more likely to go into unstructured activity. But actually, we didn't find that to be the case, right? So it appears that immigrant students are going through a different path that is more structured, more formal STEM education to get into STEM interest. Or probably for some other reason, they are already interested in STEM career, and then they decided to start off by picking up formal and structured STEM activity to begin with.
Yeah, and some literature actually suggests that a lot of immigrant students go to STEM because kind of a language barrier they have. So like a STEM career actually provide more non-language skill than the other field. But as I control for the language barrier as well, we see a lot of immigrant students to go to STEM field. So that was interesting.
Yeah. Right. Any other question from our audience? Okay, I think we can move on to our next speaker, Ryleigh Jacob. Oh, just a second. I think there is some question from the chat room. So, Elizabeth, do you want to respond to the comment in the chat room?
Yes. Could you elaborate more about the reason you said the results show that the immigrant students did not participate in out of school time activity, but they hope for STEM career?
Yeah, we have a question from Hai Wong. Do you want to speak or?
Or you can just send me the email. I will type my email address in the
Yeah.
chat. So yeah, Ryleigh can move on. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess the message means now knowing that a different generation like to participate in different kinds of activity, we actually need to design activities specifically for different generations of immigrant students, right? And also like we need to think how we can make cooking and baking accessible to immigrant students who don't have a big kitchen. So it's not like that we should just ignore them in cooking science activities, but try to make these activities more accessible and or more appealing to students who didn't participate enough. Right. All right. Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you all for your questions. Next, we have Ryleigh Jacobs. Ryleigh is a master's student in the International Education Policy Program at Harvard Graduate School of Education. She grew up in South Africa and currently lives in Canada, where she is a mathematics and science teacher. Ryleigh reluctantly obtained a chemistry undergraduate degree after persistently being encouraged by her parents, and later coupled her admiration for science with her passion for science to pursue her lifelong dream as an educator. Ryleigh is also interested in project-based learning, authentic assessment, and leading professional development for teachers in Canada, Belize, and South Africa. All right, Ryleigh, the stage is yours.
Thanks, Chen. Can everyone see just my slides?
Yes.
Awesome. Good morning. Today I am going to present on socialization into STEM and whether or not encouragement to pursue STEM from various sources of encouragement predicts career interest at the end of high school. So between 2019 and 2029, it is estimated that STEM jobs in America will grow by 8% in comparison to only 3% in other fields. Yet there are doubts as to whether or not we will have the capacity to fill these positions. The number of adolescent entrants into STEM remains a concern, particularly for Hispanic students, Black students, and American Indian students. A Harris Interactive survey found that 78% of college students majoring in STEM decided to study STEM in high school or earlier. This indicates that interactions and experiences during adolescence have powerful potential to affect whether students progress through the STEM pipeline. We can learn about these interactions and experiences through the vocational anticipatory socialization theory. VAS assumes that interactions with others relay intentional and unintentional messages which have a prominent role in shaping youth's beliefs about careers and related choices. These messages include encouragement, societal expectations, and information about specific careers. These messages are received from one of 5 socializing agents: parents and family members, teachers and educational institutions, peers, part-time jobs, and media. Now, there is much debate about which of these agents is most influential when it comes to careers, and little is known about how these influence STEM career interest, particularly across various race and ethnicity groups. Using vocational anticipatory socialization allows us to understand the socializing agents that encourage students to pursue STEM. After reviewing the literature, we developed 4 research questions. For one, are students encouraged to pursue STEM? If so, who encourages them? Does encouragement predict career interest in STEM at the end of high school? Are different encouragers more or less influential than others? And are the effects differential by various races and ethnicities? I will not spend too much time on our data collection and sample, as Elizabeth has already outlined this. Ultimately, I used the FROST dataset, a national stratified random sample of first-year college students in the United States in 2017. I specifically, however, want to highlight that 45% of our sample identified as white, 23% identified as Hispanic, 15% identified as Asian, 11% identified as Black, and 3% identified as American Indian. For our analysis, we did a binomial logistic regression with STEM interest at the end of high school as our outcome variable. For career interest, survey participants indicated their career interests at the end of school by choosing applicable careers from a list of 24 items. We then grouped these into 2 larger categories: STEM, including things like astronomer, engineer, chemist, computer programmer, and non-STEM, which included visual artist, business person, lawyer. For the purpose of our analysis, we grouped medicine and health-related careers under non-STEM. In this table, we see a breakdown of the percentages of reported career interest at the end of high school. As we can see, more students reported the highest interest in non-STEM careers. Asian students reported the highest interest in STEM at the end of high school, while Black students reported the lowest interest. Our main predictor was sources of encouragement, and this was measured in 2 ways. In our first logistic regression, we used the total number of sources, a continuous variable. In our second binomial logistic regression, we used the specific sources, so for example, parent, friends, a dummy variable, as the predictor. This information came from a survey item that asked, who encouraged you to pursue a STEM career path? Mark all that apply. We grouped the 13 item responses into 7 larger categories, including no one, parents, teachers, friends, relatives, mentors and role models, and other. In this table, we see a breakdown of the percentages of encouragement from various sources. In our sample, 57% of students indicated that no one encouraged them to pursue a STEM career. 27% indicated that parents encouraged them. 13% indicated that a relative encouraged them. 11% said friends encouraged them. 24% indicated that a teacher encouraged them. 8% indicated that a mentor or role model encouraged them, and 2% identified a source of encouragement that we did not have our list, which we labeled as other. Zooming into specific groups, we see that Asian students were actually the most likely to be encouraged, and that Hispanic students had the least amount of encouragement. Further, white students, Asian students, Black students, and American Indian students received the greatest encouragement from parents, and Hispanic students received the greatest encouragement from teachers. We also see general trends that Black, Hispanic, and in some cases, American Indian students tend to report less encouragement to pursue STEM from these various encouragers when compared to white and Asian students. We also included background variables in our binomial logistic regression. A key background variable of interest is race and ethnicity. We also controlled for variables such as gender, parental education, and if STEM was related to either parent's career. First, we estimated a logistic regression model that predicted STEM career interest from the number of sources of encouragement while controlling for other background variables. Our reference group for all of our models is white female students who received no encouragement and whose parents had a bachelor's degree and whose occupation is unrelated to STEM. Here, our model reveals several statistically significant main effects for student background traits and characteristics. Males had 3 times higher odds of reporting end of high school STEM career aspirations relative to their female counterparts. Asian students had 1.5 times higher odds relative to white students. Black students had 24% lower odds, and Hispanic students had 12% lower odds relative to white students. American Indian students had 15% lower odds when compared to their white counterparts, but this was not statistically significant. Our sample of American Indian students is unfortunately quite small. Here we see that encouragement does matter, as on geometric average, each increase in the number of encourager is associated with approximately 1.5 times higher odds of STEM career interest reported at the end of high school when compared to those that had no encouragement. We also found a statistically significant and negative interaction term between the number of sources of encouragement and Asian students, which I will explain using the following graph. Here we have a prototypical graph that demonstrates the aforementioned model with the number of encouragement sources on the x-axis and the probability of STEM career interest by the end of high school on the y-axis. As we can see, the average number of encouragers for Black, American Indian, and Hispanic students is 1, whereas it is 2 for Asian and white students. We also see that white, Black, Hispanic, and American Indian students follow the same trend and have the steepest slope, while Asian students had the most attenuated slope. Asian students had the highest intercept among all groups, meaning that when there was no source of encouragement, Asian students had the highest STEM career interests among these groups. While the probability of STEM career interest for Asian students is the highest with 1, 2, 3, and 4 sources of encouragement, here we see that when the number of encouragement sources increases for all groups, the racial gap gradually converges. We then predicted STEM career interest using the specific sources of encouragement while controlling for other background information. Here I have specified a model with only main effects. When compared to those that had no sources of encouragement, parents' encouragement increased the odds of STEM career interest by 75%, teachers by 73%, friends by 43%, relatives by 17%, and mentors and role models by 23%. And each of these were statistically significant. Then we included all the significant two-way interactions between parents and friends, parents and relatives, parents and mentors, friends and mentors, as well as between different race and ethnicity groups. There was no significant interaction between any of our predictors and gender, indicating the effect is not differential between males and females. For these specific combinations of sources of encouragement reflected by our interaction terms, we see that it is negative, which means that the combined effect of having, for example, friends and parents encourage you to go into STEM is not additive. However, it is still preferable to have multiple sources of encouragement, and I will use the figure on the next slide to illustrate this. Using the example of the interactions between parents and friends in the previous model, here is a graph that illustrates the interaction effect. We see that the probability of STEM career interest at the end of high school when neither parents nor friends are sources of encouragement is 33%. This probability increases to 50% when encouraged by only friends. The probability also increases to 54% when encouraged by parents only. And then we see when encouraged by both friends and parents, it increases to 62%. The increase in probability when encouraged by both friends and parents is not additive, due to our negative interaction term. But as you can see, it is still more preferable to have both friend and parent encouragement than only being encouraged by one of these sources. We also noticed significant interaction effects between parents and Hispanic students, as well as between parents and Asian students. The signs of the interactions are negative, demonstrating that the effect of parents' encouragement is not as strong for these two groups when compared to white students. These interactions can be illustrated using two figures, which reflect the various combinations of encouragement from parents, teachers, and friends. All of the upcoming figures look specifically at the probability in STEM career interests at the end of high school by the various race and ethnicity groups when we compare two different sources of encouragement. In each of our figures, the red hollow circle indicates probability of STEM career interests with no encouragement. Focusing on our first figure here, which compares encouragement from parents and teachers, we see that white, Black, and American Indian students follow the same trend. For these group, parents' encouragement, so the green circle, estimates higher probability of STEM career interest at the end of high school when compared to teachers, the blue triangle. We also see that there is an additive effect when students are encouraged by both parents and teachers, so the purple triangle. However, we notice that for Asian and Hispanic students, teachers' encouragement is estimated to predict higher probability of STEM career interests when compared to parents' encouragement. This considers the statistically significant interaction term between parents and these two groups. Our next figure illustrates our model by friends and parents. Again, we see that white, Black, and American Indian students follow the same trend. For these groups, parents' encouragement, so our green circle, predicts higher probability than friends' encouragement. But due to the negative interaction term between parents and friends, we see that it is not an additive effect, as illustrated by the purple triangle. However, it is still more preferable to have both parents and friends encourage adolescents to pursue STEM. For Asian and Hispanic students, friends' encouragement predicts higher probability of STEM career interests at the end of high school. Further, for Asian students and Hispanic students, we see that when students are encouraged by both parents and friends, the increase in probability of STEM career interest is not any higher than if they had just been encouraged by friends, which is really interesting. So where does that leave us? Most participants in our data set were actually not encouraged to pursue STEM, 60% of them. Of those that were encouraged, parents were most likely to encourage students to pursue STEM. All sources of encouragement increase the odds of STEM career interests at the end of high school. While the probability of STEM career interest for Asian students is the highest with 1, 2, 3, and 4 sources of encouragement, we notice that when the number of encouragement sources increases for all groups, the racial gap gradually converges, and all groups have roughly the same probability of STEM career interest. Parents' encouragement is estimated to increase the odds for white, Black, and American Indian students the most. However, friends' encouragement is estimated to increase the odds for Asian and Hispanic students the most. While this is not a causal study, there are strong implications we can infer. Encouragement matters. We need to encourage our adolescents more. As we recall, 60% of our sample were not encouraged at all to pursue STEM. We need to find ways to support different agents to encourage adolescents to pursue STEM, whether that be through intentional curriculum in the classroom, out-of-school activities that allow parents and adolescents to work together on STEM activities, or even perhaps discounts for when friends join together on out-of-school activities to bolster the encouragement between these two different socializing agents. We also have future research and ponderings. Are all sources and messages of discouragement equally influential as the ones of encouragement that we were able to see? What other factors could influence how much or little encouragement students perceive they are receiving? And something that's boggling my mind is what's going on with Asian and Hispanic students. For two groups that regard families so highly, why are we seeing this trend with parents and encouragement? If you recall, Asian students had really high encouragement from parents, but our model suggests that friends predict higher odds of STEM career interests than what parents do. So what's going on there? We also have some limitations. In our research, we coded gender to be binary. With a changing world, how can we expand our understanding of gender and thus our research? The same can be said to be true for race and ethnicity groupings. All of our students fit nicely into categories in our model, but that's not necessarily reflective of their true identities. Our survey method also has limitations in that we cannot ask nor observe about the nature of encouragement that students are receiving. What is actually being said or perceived to be encouragement to these students? Is this giving advice or motivation, for example, a teacher suggesting a STEM career? Or is it about a parent going out of their way to do STEM activities with their child? What really is that encouragement looking like for them? And if the encouragement is different, does the nature of the encouragement actually affect whether or not they pursue STEM? And lastly, career interest at the end of high school has its limitations, as there's no guarantee that they will actually pursue and persist in STEM. In this regard, a longitudinal study would be interesting to consider if encouragement makes a long-term difference in keeping people in STEM and fulfilling the jobs that we need to in the States. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryleigh. Yeah, any question from our audience? Cindy?
Thanks, Chen. Thank you, Ryleigh. What an interesting presentation. I wonder if you can put up, I think it's figure 1, where you have the 3 lines, and the Asian students line is starts highest at 1 or 2, I forget. Yes. Or no, I think maybe it's figure 2. At any rate, so my question is, and I don't remember all of the Frost data set, but is there, no, it's the graph. No, the first one that you had up. Yes, so I wondered if there was any evidence of, on a cultural basis, of expectation versus encouragement, so that a certain group of students, in this case Asian students, is there a higher family or cultural expectation that you are going to pursue a STEM career, and that has been pervasive or prevalent, I guess is a better word, from a very early age versus encouragement? And I just wondered if there was any evidence of that. And again, I don't remember what all was in the data set, but I just wonder, is there a factor of expectation versus encouragement that you see or think might explain some of the difference of the starting point here?
Yeah, so I think based on the literature that I've seen, that does explain the higher starting point. It's just the expectation that Asian students are going to pursue STEM. However, when I think back to the data set, I can't recall any question that deals specifically with that, and maybe Sue can hop in and correct me. However, one set of questions that may somehow connect quite loosely is the questions about STEM identity. So whether or not parents perceive them as STEM people or they perceive themselves as STEM people, but that doesn't always get at that cultural piece.
Thank
Agreed.
you.
Yeah.
Other questions from our audience?
Not even from Phil. What's happening?
You
Quiet
did a
group.
great job. You answered all the questions. Oh,
Yeah, it's very clear, I think. It's just so interesting to me that Asian, they don't really need parents' encouragement. They only need friends, and that's enough. But it's kind of counterintuitive or counter stereotype that Asian are more like obedient to their families' advices.
I see. So,
So
Chen, you're not so unique then.
no. Or maybe it was so, as Cindy mentioned, it's so prevalent that they don't even perceive it as encouragement anymore. They thought that was just a default, and they didn't perceive that they have been encouraged. So it's no, it could be either ways.
Yeah, I guess I have a comment that maybe you can comment on. When I was a teacher, a young teacher, I didn't really see my role so much as encouraging. It was more, I'm going to teach them the content and I'm going to develop their skills. And then it's sort of the student's responsibility to encourage themselves. And certainly I have seen, this to be, through all this research and reading, that encouragement and recognition is so important for students. And do you think that view has changed in the 50 years since I was a middle school teacher?
Yeah, so I think middle school is a different ballgame than I think high school when students are actually thinking about their careers. I'm a middle school teacher too, and I don't necessarily go out of my way and say, oh, you should become a scientist of some sort. But this has got me thinking about the fact that maybe I should. I mean, even within science, there's so many different talents and giftings that are required to succeed that are different within science. And all students have some kind of capabilities at a young age. I think students are scientists, kids are scientists from such a young age, and we're the ones that drill that out of them, right? We're always saying, oh, don't ask questions or whatever, but they're very curious. So just even starting to encourage that in middle school, and then going on to high school, I think there is more room to explicitly encourage students in certain sections of teaching science, math, whatever that may be. Because adolescence is that period where they're trying to figure out who they are, but it's often through someone else's eyes. And so that's the socialization is critical during that age period. So, Sue, my parents encouraged me to select a STEM career path. I was told I had to be a doctor, and then I didn't want to be a doctor. And then I just fell into chemistry, even though I've always wanted to be a teacher. And I didn't love it. I'm not gonna lie, I appreciate it, and I'm in awe of chemistry. But I am pretty stoked to be in teaching science.
I think Sue was answering a past question for you. She was saying that the wording of the question is, who encouraged you to select this career path? But well, that's interesting knowledge to
But I like your answer, Ryleigh.
Yes.
Funny.
Yes.
Yes, that was the exact wording of the survey question.
Ryleigh, I have a question actually. So for me, like unfortunately, stereotypically, a lot of like Asian Americans, South Asians, quote unquote, are encouraged, and I think that's a lighter word, to go into STEM. But I actually was not, and I sometimes think about maybe it's because my father immigrated here at a younger age than most parental immigrants. He came here when he was 19, because he didn't want to do what his parents wanted him to do, and he wanted to like he actually wanted to do engineering, and he, you know, like all I grew up with, you should do whatever makes you excited to wake up at 6 a.m. every day, because I don't, and like that was like the mentality in my household growing up. So like, even though I wanted to do well in school and I did well in science, I didn't want to go into it. I already knew that. And that was like no question. So I sometimes wonder like what are your thoughts on like this generation of like first gen immigrants who are raised here with like such different values and understand like similar to like my dad, who's like kind of a different example because he wasn't actually born here, and like care more about passion, rather than like, you know, going to the right path. And do you think that encouragement might change for the next generation, like so the first gen's kids, and it might change like the color of the workforce in STEM?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, one that I don't have the answer to, and I should probably pair up with Elizabeth to figure out what that looks like. And I wonder if this too is a limitation of our research. There's so many different groups within this Asian classification, that it might look different, because I also know some first gen immigrants who still have that strict mindset of going into STEM. And I guess it just depends on the person and the family, which we can't really tell from our data set right now, but it would be interesting to pursue that.
Great. Okay, thank you, Ryleigh, for your presentation and everybody's else comment. I just want to take a few minutes to briefly introduce Brooke's work. Brooks unfortunately cannot present today. She is a master's student at Harvard Graduate School of Education, and she's also a strategic data project fellow at Harvard Center for Education Policy Research. She just sent me her slides a few minutes ago. I just want to share it with you to point out some of the most interesting figures. So if you have questions, you can shoot Brooke email. So her title is Locked Out of STEM. I think it's a very interesting question to look into. So do barriers to participation in OST or out of school time STEM activity predict eventual STEM career interest? So in our survey, we have these questions like, if you didn't participate in any out of school activity, what was the reason that you didn't participate? And the reason, the available options are didn't know, not available, no time, no resource, not interested in the topic, not interested in STEM, not feeling welcomed, and other. Or some students, they didn't participate in any OST and they didn't give an answer. So we just categorize them as no answer given, right? So here is an interesting graph that look at, so for each of the reasons that students gave, what was their predicted average STEM career interest, right? And here on the very right hand, we have students who participate in STEM OSC activities. So their career interest is high up, but equally high up here are students who didn't participate OST because there wasn't a resource. So it kind of suggested though they will very well excel and persist in STEM if there were resource made available for them. And even if they didn't have resource and they didn't participate in any OST, they are actually equally interested in STEM career interest. And here in this bottom box are students who already said they're not interested. So it seems they're just very determined that they're not going to STEM. And we have other reasons such as didn't know about it or didn't give a reason. and we have students who said no time, program not available, not feeling welcome. So their career interest is up around the mean, right? I think this is somewhat standardized. So 0 is the grand average. And this graph is, I think, most interesting, that x-axis is parent education. Y is probability in STEM career interest. And different color lines means the different reasons for not participating in STEM. And the top line are the group who actually participate in STEM. We see that they have the highest STEM career interest, and as their parent education increase, their STEM career interest increases, right? And for those who already said they are not interested in STEM, and the higher the parent education was, the little interest they are, the less interest they become in STEM career. So it looks like these parents have already gave their kids some guidance or some support to explore other interests. So they are the least invested in STEM, and those who said they didn't have time, but if they have a higher parent education, their career interest was actually pretty high up here. Maybe likely due to that their parents are managing the time for these students, so they didn't have time to go to OST, but they probably are engaging in many other activities. So I just want to show these two graphs. I think it's most interesting. And if you have question, you should shoot Brooke. Well, she didn't put her email here. I will type her email in the chat box. All right. So we are actually past 12 o'clock. Any final comments? Anyone urging to give a last comment about something inspire you and you find interesting? Oh, Sue?
So I'm sure Phil would have something more inspiring. I just thought these were great. I thought you might want to meet the team who collected all of the data for you to do these surveys. So people, Annette, who's doesn't have her camera on, recruited and collected all of this data. So thank you, Annette. And Cindy, Cindy and John and Erica helped actually develop the surveys and spent a lot of time doing literature and sending out pilot tests. And I just thought it's nice to meet the people who actually, both do the survey collection and those who do the data analysis. That's all.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say one other posse member, Claire, is working on a project right now. She'll certainly present next year. She's a doctoral student in astronomy. Yeah, I can say this is just like totally impressive. I mean, the work, the projects that you did are so beyond what one can imagine from master's students. I know when I got my master's degree at the ed school in 1974, I could never have done anything like this. This is just totally incredible. It's this year's group has really competed with last year's group, Tommy's group, and with the SIPO and others last year. I'm going to have to think hard about which group was the best of all the last years. But you guys are definitely the top two. And I want to thank Chen for his exceptional job working with the posse members. Very patient, working with, helping with the literature reviews and all the statistical analysis. And Gerhard has been a tremendous father to the group, where he's always interested and cheerful and follows everything completely. I have to get reminded what people's projects are every week. They have to tell me what the point was and what the variables were. But Gerhard's right on top of it. And Sue has joined the posse this year and done a great job giving advice to students and giving the real context for these projects and how the data was collected and answering people's questions. So it's really been a terrific group this year, and everything has come together perfectly, except for COVID.
But we did well considering the difficult times. We persisted, and we are very productive. So I think that's a kudos to everybody.